Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this video on CMS Workplan budgets. My name is Brett Connor. I'm the Grants Manager here at DCYF, and I'll be taking some time to walk you through the details of what we're looking for when you complete your budget in the CMS system for DCYF. This is something that, of course, you'll be doing now at the beginning of the new grant cycle, and you will be repeating at the beginning of every new fiscal year throughout that 5-year cycle. If you have any questions, I've given you my phone number and my email. Feel free to ask me those questions, or you can save them to meet me in person on April 9th for workshops. I'll be telling you a little bit about more at the end of this video. So as a DCYF grantee, you are going to be required to file a work plan in our contract management system, which we call CMS. That work plan has both your programmatic information as well as your budget information. So there are multiple opportunities to be trained on how CMS works. I won't be going into those details in this video, but there are other videos online on the DCYF website. There are a series of grantee orientations where CMS will be covered in detail, and DCYF will be hosting multiple events throughout the coming months to help train on CMS data entry and everything you need to know about that system. This video is really going to be specific to the content of the budget section of CMS. So the first thing you should know about a DCYF budget is that we have 7 distinct budget categories. Those are listed here in front of you. We'll be going into each and every one of them in detail. But as you're looking at your program budget and looking to translate that into your CMS work plan, bear in mind that we are going to be asking you to fit your expenses into one of these 7 categories. The first category is adult staff. Now, these are the salaries for the adults who are going to provide direct program services. And we have 4 tiers of staff that we consider under this category. That's executive and senior leadership, program manager, direct service provider, and support staff. So all the staff who are providing those direct program services should fold into one of those 4 general areas. In the work plan, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment, we ask you to have 1 entry for each individual staff member, and that you report the salaries as an hourly wage. So you might need to do a bit of a translation to take what is paid as an annual salary and translate it into an hourly wage. This is a screenshot of CMS. This is just the adult staff section. We'll do this for all of the remaining budget sections. And it shows an example of an adult staff entry. So in this case, there's a staff member who's been mapped onto the role of program manager. That's one of the 4 roles I just spoke about earlier. That person's title is the manager of youth programming, and his name is John Smith. Now we're asking for the numbers in 2 ways. One is the hourly wage, so John's being paid $35 an hour. Then we're asking for the total pay that John's going to be receiving through this grant over the course of the entire fiscal year. In this case, that's $15,000. The system automatically calculates the yearly hours field, so you don't need to worry about entering that or calculating that. You just need to enter the wage and how much you'll be reimbursing for on John Smith's salary for this program. Note there's a roles and responsibilities section. It's a common entry for all of our budget areas. It's a chance for you to communicate to DCYF about this particular line item. Maybe in some cases you're showing some calculations for how you reached it. Just giving us some budget notes so that an external person from your organization can understand what's going on there. So that's adult staff. The next category is youth staff. Now, youth are young people who are being paid salaries for working for the program. It's slightly different in its entry than adult staff, whereas with adult staff we asked for each individual person to have their own entry. For youth staff, We ask for one entry for every class of youth staff. And what I mean by that is you may have multiple youth who all have the same title, who are all earning the same hourly wage, and who are all working the same number of hours. That's very common in youth programming. You can wrap all of them up into a single line item and report them as a class. And I'll show you what that looks like in the next slide. So here we have the youth staff section from CMS, and you can see there are two entries here, one for interns and one for summer ambassadors. So the first one, interns, you can see that there are 5 interns for this program. Each is earning a wage of $15 an hour and working 10 weeks a year for total payments to this entire class of interns of $6,000. As with adult staff, the system is calculating the number of hours a week that each of those interns is working. Now they're distinct from the summer ambassadors in that the summer ambassadors are paid a different hourly wage, they're working a different number of weeks a year, and their pay is different as well. So that's why they're entered in as 2 separate categories. But you can see in just these 2 listings, there are in fact 25 youth staff being represented. The next budget category is fringe benefits. These are for benefits and withholdings that are associated with employment with your agency. That includes FICA, health benefits, retirement benefits, SUI, vacation and comp time payouts, and workers' compensation are all eligible expenses under this category. And here is the CMS reflection of that. In this case, there have been 2 entries under fringe, one for FICA and one for health benefits. So in both of these cases, we've asked for a specific call out of the individual line item under fringe. We're asking that you don't report fringe as just a single percentage of salary. You very well might budget for fringe that way, but when reporting to us what your expenses are going to be through this budget, we ask that you do this line item itemization. So in this case, it's FICA and health benefits, and there's some details included on each of those lines about how those amounts were calculated. The next budget category is subcontractors. What I mean by subcontractors are external parties that are working in direct service of the program. What I mean specifically is outside individuals. They could be nonprofits, or they could be for-profit companies, or even individuals or sole proprietors who you've contracted to provide program services directly with your youth. You may recall, if you've been a DCYF grantee in the past, we used to have a category called professional. That category no longer exists. So you may have contractors who are not working with the youth directly. Those aren't considered subcontractors, and I'll show you where they may be placed elsewhere in your budget. But what we're talking about here in this line are those who are providing services very similar to those that would be provided by your program staff. If you have subcontractors, we need you to have an MOU in place with that party or individual. A note on subcontractors, they themselves cannot use subcontractors. So you as the lead agency can have subcontractors, but subcontractors cannot use subcontractors. It's perfectly appropriate for lead agencies to have multiple subcontractors, that's fine, but the subs themselves can't have subcontractors. And bear in mind that as a lead agency, you're responsible for working with your subcontractors to make sure they are aware of their obligations as a city subcontractor. They're held to the same contractual obligations, the same compliance requirements, the same insurance requirements that you as the lead agency are. So you very well might want to share the grant agreement with your subcontractors because they are held to those specifications as well. Here's the subcontractors posting from CMS. As you can see in this case, there's a subcontractor named Yoga for Youth. There's some contact information for that organization and a brief description of what that subcontractor will be doing. The total amount that this sub will be receiving in this grant is $20,000. Now that is entered in as an entirely separate budget. I won't show you that on this video, but if you were to click on the link that says Edit Subcontractor Budget, you'll be taken to a page that looks exactly like the page we're just looking at with all the budget categories. and it allows you to enter in for every single existing line item what that subcontractor's expenses will be. On the main page, which is what we're looking at now, only the total amount of funds going to that subcontractor shows. In this case, it's $20,000. So again, the one difference between the subcontractor budget and your budget as a lead agency is that there's no subcontractor line item under subcontractors. Once again, subcontractors can't have subcontractors of their own. The next budget section is materials and supplies. These are either office supplies or program supplies, and these are items that we expect to be replaced over the course of the year. A very simple entry into CMS for this line item, simply indicate whether it's a program or an office supply. Here is a program supply. And the $2,500 allocated to it is given a brief description as being $100 for each youth served. You don't necessarily have to go into excruciating detail about every single pen and pencil you plan to buy. This kind of description is perfectly acceptable. The next and the largest budget category we have is other program expenses. And these are capturing expenses that haven't been personnel related and aren't sub-related. They aren't materials and supplies, but they are expenses that are directly incurred by the program. And there's several categories underneath this that I'll go into some detail on. These include communications, equipment. Now, equipment is different than materials and supplies, whereas materials and supplies we expect you to use up during the course of the year. Equipment we expect to outlive the fiscal year. So a good example is a computer. Obviously, you buy a computer this year, it's a perfectly eligible equipment expense, but you'll have it for multiple years to come. Fees associated with the program, field trips. Food is something I want to say a brief comment on. We do ask all of our grantees who have programs of 3 hours or more to provide a snack to youth. We have a detailed nutrition policy that supports that food provision. That's detailed in our Doing Business with DCYF guide. We'll also go into detail on that in our upcoming workshop. But one thing to keep in mind in terms of the budget is we do not allow snack expenses greater than $2.50 per youth per snack. Moving on, there are other expenses, human resources, insurance mandated by the program, maintenance, occupancy, I'll say a word on. The main occupancy expense we see is rent, but if you are a program operating in a space that is owned by the agency, you are eligible for what we call cost recovery, and that's something you can speak with your program specialist on to see how DCYF allows for the budgeting of expenses for programs that are happening in owned space. So talk to your program specialist about cost recovery if you own your building. The next element is participant incentives, professional development, special events, stipends, transportation, utilities. And while every single budget category has an other category, one particular other here is going to be contractors that are providing program evaluation services. So in the past, we again had this professional category that no longer exists. If you're bringing in a contractor not to work directly with the youth, that's a subcontractor, but a contractor who's coming in to work with the agency in support of the program. For example, they may be providing evaluation services for the program. That's going to be an expense held here under other program expenses. Here's what that line item looks like in CMS. In this example, there are two program expenses called out. One is occupancy and one is field trips. A note on occupancy, because you're going to see this again. It's an example of an expense that actually can occur in multiple budget categories at the same time, and that's because rent can be both a programmatic expense and an administrative overhead expense. So you can see, as the applicant here has spelled out, when they are putting occupancy into their budget, they are allocating a certain percentage of their total rent to this program. In this case, they've allocated 25% of that rent to this program. That's likely because the program takes up, for example, 25% of the total square footage that the agency uses for its entire operations. Field trips is the second element here, and there's a little description about the number of field trips that are being taken this fiscal year and the components of that expense, admissions and transportation. The final budget category I'll be going into detail on is administrative. These are for general, what you might think of as overhead expenses. These are expenses that are supporting general agency operations, and they're distinct from program expenses. You might notice right off the bat that several of these expenses are the same ones that were just shown as other program expenses. That's very normal, just like the rent expense example I talked about earlier. Many expenses can live in different budget categories. That's fine as long as it's an allocation plan that's put forth and explained in CMS. I won't talk about all of these again, many of them I just mentioned, but a few I'll call out specifically. The first is agency administrative fees. This is an unusual expense, but we do see it in certain cases, specifically where there are programs that operate under the umbrella of a larger organization, and that organization is providing certain back office support to the program, and they charge a flat fee for that. That fee would be reflected here as an administrative fee. Several finance-related fees, starting here with audit, are administrative fees. You see contractors here again, just as we've seen before. If you bring in an outside party that's providing support to your agency, that would be reflected here under contractors. If you're a program that uses a fiscal sponsor and they charge a fee for those services, those fiscal sponsorship fees are reflected here. And tax preparation, again, another finance-related fee that you'll find under administrative. Note that there is a cap of 15% on all administrative expenses. They cannot exceed 15% of your total grant. And that includes if any of your subcontractors have administrative expenses, those are part of this 15% cap. This is the CMS reflection of administrative. You can see there are two entries here. Again, occupancy shows up, and you can see it's the same $2,000 a month rent, but for their administrative expenses, they've allocated 10% of that rent to this line item. Also, we see that there's some personnel included under administrative. This is personnel providing finance support, in this case a part-time bookkeeper, and some of that time of that bookkeeper, 10% specifically, has been allocated to this grant. Now, that's a reflection of all of the expenses that are allowed to be reimbursed by your DCYF grant. There are expenses that in some cases are not allowed, so I want to spend a few slides talking about those. In general, expenses that you cannot use DCYF funds to support are those that merely benefit children and youth incidentally. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. You might have an event that is a general community event, perhaps it's at a public park. And at that event, you'd expect all members of the community to come. Now, that's going to, of course, include children and youth, but there are likely going to be adults as well. Again, this is a general admission event. That's not a specific youth event, so that's not something that your DCYF grant can be used to support. Other expenses we can support are fundraising, religious workshops and instruction, political activities, and anything else that's called out specifically in the San Francisco Charter. Now, individual line items in the budget have their own disallowable expenses. Now, some of them are disallowable in total, and some of them are simply disallowable in that budget category, meaning that they are more appropriately placed elsewhere, and in that other category they would be eligible. I'll explain what I mean as we go through this. So under adult and youth staff, stipends are not allowed. Now, as I called out earlier, stipends are an appropriate expense under other program expenses. Salaries for administrative staff shouldn't be placed here under adult and youth staff. Again, adult and youth staff is just for program staff. Your administrative staff salaries should be held under the administrative budget line. We also don't allow payment of performance bonuses or severance. Under the Fringe line, any PTO accruals aren't allowed to be used for DCYF reimbursement. What I mean by that is vacation or sick time as it is accrued. Now, we do allow for the payment of vacation and sick time, but we allow for that as it's paid out to the staff member, not as it is accrued over time. We also don't allow for reimbursement of taxes or salary withholdings that weren't occurred in the actual grant term. Under subcontractors, if you have contractors providing services in either support of the program or for administrative services to the agency in general, don't put those here. Those aren't subcontractor expenses. They're likely other program expenses and administrative expenses. Under materials and supplies, anything that you buy that is to be used for your general agency operation, again, not in direct support and use by the program, don't put that here. Again, you can probably include those under your administrative expenses. And anything that's durable, something that's not going to be used up during the course of the year. Again, like that computer example, that is equipment and that's an other program expense. And under administrative, any costs that are actually directly connected back to the program. That's a program expense, and we want you to hold it as a program expense and not have it taking up any of your 15% administrative cap. Now, other program expenses, there are a lot of subcategories there, so there's a lot of disallowable expenses in that. I'm going to walk through this entire list, so hang on, here we go. In general, expenses that are not directly related to the program should not go here. They may be able to be put elsewhere in your budget, but not under this line item. Any penalties or fees relating from late payments you might make, those aren't eligible. Any items, materials, supplies, not in use by the program, any late fees or bank overdraft fees. Here's the line on youth snacks that I mentioned earlier. Anything in excess of $2.50 per youth per snack is not going to be allowed. Staff meals, for example, a staff outing to a restaurant is not something that you can use your DCYF grant to support. Alcoholic beverages, capital expenses, so the purchase of a building or any major renovations or capital improvements to a space that you're renting, those aren't allowed under a DCYF grant. Depreciation, property taxes, rent for your administrative space. Again, rent is a perfectly allowable expense, but for your admin space, that should go under the administrative budget line. Security deposits aren't allowed. In time, you will get that money back, so we can't reimburse for it on this grant. Cost for loans against your own property, so a mortgage is not something you can use for a DCYF grant. The acquisition of real property, again, that's a capital expense that we can't allow. Cost recovery, I talked about cost recovery earlier. That's the costs associated with programs that are operating in an agency's owned space. While you can certainly use cost recovery, there are some limits to it. In that case, $25 per square foot or 10% of the total grant are the limits on cost recovery. And again, your program specialist can help walk you through the parameters of cost recovery. Be sure to ask them about that. Staff recognitions or non-programmatic celebrations are not allowed. Events that are attended by staff only. Stipends greater than $600. Again, you can pay stipends, but you can't pay a stipend that's greater than $600. If you do have a situation where you have a young person who is providing service to the agency, but will be paid more than that, we expect that young person to be paid as youth staff and to be receiving a salary, not a lump stipend. Stipends or incentives for adults older than 24, we can't have that. Our funding is specifically for children and youth and transitional age youth, and the cutoff age for that is 24. Parking and moving violations, towing violations, and the cost of purchasing a vehicle without getting prior consent from DCYF. It is perfectly fine to use your grant to purchase, for example, a van to transport young people to and from your program, but you need to get DCYF permission before you do so. A few general suggestions to bear in mind as you're completing your work plan budget. The first is to provide the full cost of your program, to the greatest extent based on, of course, the award amount that you receive, and to think broadly about what are all the costs that your agency is incurring to support this program. Part and parcel of that is to be aware of shared expenses, that there are some expenses that are shared by multiple components of your agency, to make sure that the fair share of those that can be loaded onto this program are in fact loaded into this budget so that we can support them. I encourage you to get some input from others. If you are the agency's finance person, make sure you send your budget before you submit it to DCYF. Send it past your program staff. Send it by your executive leadership team. Make sure they take a look at it and that they provide some input to make sure, again, that all the costs are accurate and that it's a fair reflection of the full load of the program expense. Please be specific with your budget. Most line items have pull-down menus where you can list out specific categories of expense. We expect you to do a very fine line item detail whenever it is possible. So do be specific. Provide us details in numbers and in words. Of course, you're going to give us the dollar amount in numbers, but then each line item does have a section to type in budget notes. Please utilize that functionality. It's very helpful for us as we are looking at your budget and trying to assess it. If you can provide a few notes along the way to help us understand where the numbers came from, what is the relation to the program, and anything else you think might help DCYF assess your budget. And final bit of advice, avoid using the other category. Now there is an other category for all of our line items, and of course use it where you find it necessary. But before you use it, make sure there isn't another element of that expense that isn't really a fair reflection of the grant, and use that instead. A few words on doing business with DCYF. This is our published policy manual. Not only does this guide have all the information on budgets that we've gone over here in this video, but it has information on all of our policies. You can download that guide at our website. It's www.dcyf.org. Also, all of our grantees are being asked to attend an April 9th workshop that's going to specifically go into details of doing business. So that'll be a chance both to get a hard copy of it that you can take back to your agency and to ask DCYF staff questions you might have about budgets, of course, and also about anything else that's a requirement for your grant that's outlined in doing business. That brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions about anything as you're completing your work plan budget, be it work plan budgets or anything related to your program, please call your program specialist, have a conversation with them, and we'll be sure that you get all the support you need. Again, thank you so much for your attention, and we look forward to having you as a DCYF grantee. Goodbye.